Okay, so yeah, basically, the idea is that we take you basically through the talk today, and but obviously it's slightly different, it's slightly a meta level because we're kind of talking about the talk. So, and especially as we're a small group, we'll probably stop a bit more often, just every couple of slides maybe to see if there's questions as we go along. And then there's also going to be, so I'm going to start the presentation in a second, and then Keith will take over. We also have a couple of, in addition to these ad hoc questions as we go along, we're going to do a couple of breakout groups. It's the first time I've actually done that personally, but I've had a little practice earlier, so hopefully that should work. And that simulates what we would actually, one way to do this talk, which is, yeah, to split people up into smaller groups and discuss any number of questions. So we'll be doing that a bit later. Yeah, I think that's all I needed to say for the moment. And then once we've done once we've gone through the talk itself, we should have a bit of time at the end, in addition to like addressing any more questions you have, to talk a little bit about maybe our working group a bit more generally and what we get up to. And Kathy's also going to take you through just the logistics of if you're at the end of this session, you still want to give the talk, hopefully, yourselves, what that means, and yeah, and how to stay in touch, basically. Okay, so let's see if I can just share. Okay, so what is Citizens Assembly? Why do we need one on climate and ecological justice? Slight typo in the first slide there, never mind. Yeah, basically that's what this talk is about. We're going to be taking you through exactly what a Citizens Assembly is and why XR is calling for one. Okay, XR being Extinction Rebellion. So these are the three demands. Maybe let's just get a quick show of hands who's heard of the three demands. Okay, great, that's pretty much everyone, I think. So obviously you might go into a little bit more detail in this if you're giving the talk yourself, but there you have them: tell the truth, act now, and then the one that's most relevant for this talk, although obviously all three are constantly intertwined, but the third one, and if I just move this thing, beyond politics, create a national citizens assembly on climate and ecological justice. The actual wording is for government to set up to create and be led by a citizens assembly on climate and ecological justice, which is really key. We'll see that a little bit later, that the government is behind it and prepared to be led by it. What is a citizens assembly? Okay, I imagine probably most of you here have a fairly good idea of what it is. It's a randomly selected and statistically representative group of members of the public who learn and deliberate on an issue of public concern. So it's not just obviously related to climate change, it's not a new thing. And the key point there is the word deliberate. This is a form of deliberative democracy, which in turn is a kind of a form of direct democracy. So I would say personally, up until relatively recently, really, if you'd have said democracy to me, I would have equated that quite closely with elections. A lot of us tend to think that elections is almost synonymous with the idea of democracy, and this kind of breaks that mold. So basically, what's really important here is that people are really engaging with the issues, learning about them, and deliberating them on together, and then informing policy. Exactly what that looks like in practice we'll go through in the next slides. But the key here is that it's not just you're making an informed judgment. Yeah, mini public, that's a term that is used to describe this kind of microcosm of the population as a whole, which is this randomly selected group of people. And the key aspect of citizens' assemblies is that the change must come from the people, not elites. So that basically means that especially when we're looking at the climate crisis, we're looking at radical, in order to achieve this demand too, act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. By 2025, that's massive radical changes that are going to affect us in a big way. So in order to be able to do that in a just way that people can accept, those kinds of changes must be proposed by people and not by an elite. Equally, that works the other way around, because this also appeals to governments themselves, because from the Citizens' Assembly, you get a mandate for them to take action. So not only will the Citizens' Assembly create acceptance among the people, but also the government itself can sort of say, look, this is what the people have decided, and it enables them to take more assertive action. These are the 6 steps of the Citizens' Assembly. First, as I said, you randomly select the people. And this is a similar idea to, well, it's exactly the same, in fact, as how juries are selected. So this random selection is also known as sortition, which is just a snazzy word for saying exactly the same thing, random selection. But the thing with Citizens' Assembly is not only do you randomly select from the whole population, you then also ensure that that mini public actually is demographically representative of the public. Because obviously if you just randomly select people, it might not be proportionally, say, the right amount of men and women, or non-binary people, or across a range of different characteristics. So that's a second step. We'll look at that on the next slide in a bit more detail. But once you have this body of people, they then come together over a period of time, and this is it's done in a number of different ways. So you can have everything from a weekend or two if it's a smaller issue, or if it's not been set up properly. But sometimes it might be a big issue, but it's rushed. In British Columbia, they had a Citizens' Assembly that lasted almost a year. Obviously, people are then, it's just every few weekends that people are going. So you have this, the first stage of the Citizens' Assembly itself is the learning phase. So this is where people listen to the experts. So in the case of climate change, that will be obviously people like climate scientists, but also it might be farmers and people really at the forefront of the climate crisis, and also rights holders, which means in the UK, for instance, that might mean people in coastal communities, such as a village in Fairbourne, where it's already become established that they're going to have to all basically move in the next couple of decades, because the council can't afford to keep up the sea defences. So rights holders would be the people most imminently affected by this. So once people have the citizens, the assembly members, I also just thought I should say the assembly is normally about 50 to 150 people. So after that second step, the third one, we have submissions from the public. So in addition to these inputs from experts and rights holders, you also, the entire population, in our case of the UK, would have the right basically to make a submission to the assembly. So that could be a sort of factual submission of in terms of the way they sort of see the situation, or the policies that they think should be taken. But it could also just be their hopes and dreams on a more emotional level. So then the members of the assembly read these submissions, and they can also invite specific people who've made these submissions to come and talk in person. As I'm going through these, there's also bits I'm missing out, but I'm realizing that I also kind of don't want to spend too long, but we'll go into some of these aspects in a bit more detail later in the talk. So the fourth stage here is facilitated deliberation in small groups. So this is where the real magic happens, and this is where this form of democracy really comes into its own. So you basically, this is where you split up the assembly into smaller groups. And the key word there again is facilitators. You have professional facilitators who ensure that everyone is getting their voice heard, especially if it's maybe people who wouldn't normally be heard in a discussion, and that those basically keeping the dynamics really inclusive and and making sure that no one voice is dominating. And that's the moment, like I say, that's where the sort of magic happens, because those are the moments where you get, say, a CEO sitting with someone who's more excluded from society in some way, or someone from a remote area of the UK, or these kinds of things, and all sitting together. And it's that moment where kind of like, I don't know, I always just think of like family barbecues personally, where you're just sort of confronted with sort of distant family members, where you're like, well, we live in completely different worlds. But now we're actually talking about an issue and sort of starting to hopefully see some common ground. So that's what happens there, basically. And then what comes out of that is draft and vote and recommendations. So the assembly itself puts together recommendations, which will then go to government. And they produce a report, and each of the recommendations is voted on. So even though this process is broadly looking to achieve consensus, that isn't essential. You can have a recommendation which doesn't have 100% support, and that is noted then. So along with the recommendation, you have 80% of members supported this recommendation. Okay, and then the final stage is recommendations are debated and implemented. That means by Parliament, or whichever body has set up the assembly. Again, that's a really key aspect to do with the legislative power that the assembly has, and we'll come back to that as well. Okay, I've just worked out how to actually see it at a glance. Does anyone have any questions?
Michelle asked, these stages are obviously best practice, and not all citizens' assemblies would have all these stages, or as extensive as you describe, e.g. what is the definition of random? Who would determine the experts? Submissions can only be made if public are aware and know how to. And what happens if the recommendations may not be implemented? Okay,
well, yeah, really good points. That's sort of, maybe a couple of these we'll answer in the course of the talk, but to take the first point, yeah, this is an ideal situation. And that's what we're asking for as XR. We're asking for the best possible citizens' assembly, and that would include all of these points. And the government has the resources to implement that, is what I would say. In terms of random selection, you have bodies that specialize in doing this, such as the Sortition Foundation. And yeah, on the other hand, yeah, I guess my answer would actually have two aspects. One, yes, this is ideal, and I think we should aim for the stars, because a lot of this is possible. Two, it's never going to be absolutely perfect. For instance, yeah, you can't get a perfect random selection of absolutely everyone, because even defining what everyone means is a contentious political point. But we would argue for the largest body of people, so not just UK citizens, but also people resident here. Yeah, maybe. So I've started to answer that, but maybe we can come back to the other points later, if that's okay.
Just Alex, kind of say.
Yeah.
So on best practice, that we've actually got a guide of that a Citizen Assembly expert has written for us, the 12 best, basically 12 things you need to have a Citizens Assembly. So we would expect all Citizens Assemblies to abide by those, and Citizens Assemblies to be the gold standard. Something called Future Democracy Hub has just been launched, which has a whole menu of things. So if you can't afford a full citizens' assemblies and all the stages there, you can do a smaller citizens' jury, or you can do other deliberative methods. So we would expect, and we would push for every citizens' assemblies to be this kind of gold standard.
Okay, Thanks, Keith. Yeah, that's a really good point, because obviously I'm talking about the National Citizens Assembly that we're calling for. At local level, you can't have the kind of scale that we're talking about here. We'll come back to local and national later as well. I see that there are more questions, but can we crack on a couple more slides and then do a couple more? Is that all right, Keith?
I would suggest we try and cover quite a few slides, and then we should have covered most of those points, and then perhaps we'll come back to the questions. I'll just keep an eye on the questions, which is one from Catherine and one from Joe.
Great. And also we can share, I can just pop a link in the chat a bit later with Martin's 12 standards as well, so that everybody has that. Okay. So this is back to that first point. So the random selection, as I said, that's called sortition. And then you also have this stage where you make your mini public sort of reflect demographically the population at large. And that process is called stratification, unfortunately. So we've got two slightly unusual terms. So yeah, this slide, I think we've got, the stats up there. So on the left, let's say this is the general population. And let's say for the sake of argument for the moment that you have 50% women and 50% men. Although obviously you would have non-binary people in the population as well. And what you do is you split that up into men and women. And you need to basically make sure, say, for the sake of maths, you have a citizens assembly of 100 people. Then you would want 50 women and 50 men. So from all of the men, you select 50, and from all the women, you select 50. Mathematically, that's probably never going to be that easy, but just in terms of understanding it, that's how that works. And then obviously you can stratify in terms of a range of different characteristics. So not just gender, but also age, geographical location, educational level, maybe one or two others. Okay, I was going to hand over to Keith to do the next bit. Is that all right, Keith? We can't hear you.
Yep, sorry. Probably for the best. Okay, so where are we at? We're at, you're going to have to click through, obviously.
Yeah, I'll click through.
Okay, so we're talking about where it's happened in the world, I'm guessing. Do you want to click through quite a few? I normally skip through this quite quickly. So it's actually been happening all over the place for quite a while. It's not just something that's popped up in the last year, although basically due to, because I'm part of the Sortition Foundation, and we've been pushing this for years. And in the last year, because of XR, it has exploded. But before that, we've had a whole stack of citizens' assemblies in Australia, where they managed to get it as part of the councils had to do some form of deliberative or some kind of engagement with the local population, and someone managed to go in and go, you're going to do citizens' assembly, and they've done some really good ones. Obviously, the ones in Ireland that came out with the results for gay marriage and abortion. The G1000 is something that's happened in the Netherlands. It started in, can't remember, country near the Netherlands. Spain, was it Spain? Oh, Belgium. But they've done about 30 of them now. These are one-day events, deliberative events. They get 1,000 randomly selected people, not stratified, and they get them together and they talk about various issues around their community, and they're brilliant engaging things for your community. And I've seen one of those happen. So you can see there's other forms of deliberative democracy out there. And the one hidden behind, I think, is a permanent citizens' assembly to run the German part of Belgium. Is that correct? Okay. I should know. Okay, do you want to skip on? So it's happening all over the place. Next, Alex. Okay, so we've got the one in Ireland. It ran so it had 99 citizens and bizarrely one judge. So they can take different forms. There were quite a few issues with this citizens' assembly. So while we hold it up as an example, when you talk to the experts, they go, this is wrong, this was wrong, this was wrong. So it's a process that's still being refined. Okay. One of the key things with Citizens Assembly, and which is the big advantage in Ireland, is the fact they take something that's very toxic for both sides. So neither side in Ireland could deal with these issues, and yet pushing it out to the people seemed to them like a good thing to do, not knowing they're actually going to lose essentially their power. But they're essentially saying, well, you decide. You know, so it's because otherwise, if they must take a stance, say, on abortion, they'll instantly get voted out, which is the big issue with the voting system. Do you want to skip on, Alex? Oh, yeah, you can. Is that you want to speak or you don't? Oh, I see. Okay, I need notes on this one because I don't really use this slide.
Okay. Yeah, no, this is just the point about the abortion. Can you hear me? Sorry, Kathy, can you wave your hands?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So this is the point about the abortion Citizens Assembly in Ireland, and that you know when I mentioned earlier that the recommendation goes forward with a particular percentage of support among Assembly members for abortion, to change the abortion laws in Ireland to bring them up to the European standard, which I think is 12 weeks. That reached 64% support, and this is just to show that the referendum that then took place afterwards, partly as a result of the Citizens Assembly, had 66%. So it shows you, basically this slide is to show you that that the Assembly is representative. It did a good job of like reflecting the population at large.
Cool. And the next slide is a really powerful one for XR. Do you want to flip on? There we go. Because we're stuck with politicians who essentially are not doing anything about climate change at all. And when you ask the people including farmers and those kind of people whose industries depend on these kind of things and need to make radical changes, they understand that there is a massive problem and they want to make the changes. So this is why XR is pushing a solution, because it'll actually ask the people and use get evidence-based policies. Okie dokie, what's next? So we have a big issue with the fact that someone at the very beginning called something of people's assemblies, a question we just had earlier from Alan, I think. I just last night I was Instagramming or looking Instagram, and it's just like someone says, that's why we're pushing for people's assemblies, and you have to sit there on your phone and go to Citizens Assembly. Someone plastered it all over the tube as well. A people's assembly is a small thing you get together. It's totally self-selected, and you just sit down there. So it's just essentially a decision-making way. A good thing about it, which is why we're using it, is that it shows how deliberation works, how sitting down with other people, listening to some people who have knowledgeable about the subject, because normally the People's Assembly, a few people stand up who actually have expertise in the field, unless it's like making a decision like, are we going to stay on this roadblock? And so you still have that deliberative thing where you're looking into people's eyes, there's some empathy with each other, you're not standing there shouting at each other, you're actually listening. So it's facilitated deliberation. Just quickly, somebody talked about the self-selection aspect of random selection, and that is true. There is a thing of self-selection, but we do our best to mitigate it. So for a start, the people are paid. The people in Cambridge were paid £300 to attend 2 weekends, which is a reasonable amount of cash. Initially, when we put the bid in, we weren't going to pay people, and everybody just went, you have to. And it makes a real difference. Also, just advertising about it, so telling people about the Citizens Assembly so that people understand there is this happening. They will be able to make a decision about things. They'll be able to directly affect things. And also ensuring that people know that Citizens Assembly will have a mandate to do things. So in Cambridge, the heads of the 3 councils who are involved have all signed a letter that got sent out to 10,000 people saying, you know, we are going to implement what's coming out of this. So that's how you help deal with the people not turning up, the self-selection issues. Next slide. Nope. Alex? Nope. Nope. Is crank it. So we've produced, first of all, there was the People's Assemblies Manual, which came out, showed how to do People's Assemblies. In retaliation, we have produced the Guide to Citizens' Assemblies, which we've been, like a couple of days ago, we were given to MPs. So it has a guide of how to do it. And that is well worth a read. That's pretty much the definitive text on citizens' assemblies now. I think so. Contains a lot of information, so go through that. Yep. Okay, next. Why do we need one? Don't know what's. I mean, yeah. So you can ask what a deliberative democracy needs for you.
So yeah, Keith.
Cool.
Sorry, this is where I thought we could split up into groups. So at this point, also in the actual talk itself, we have a number of questions that you can use to discuss in smaller groups and kind of get everyone on the same page, which is what I suggest we do now. So maybe we'll take. I'm just wondering. Shall we clear up a couple? Suggestion. Should we clear up a couple of the questions from the chat? I'm not sure whether we've answered all of them, just because they might be on people's minds. And we'll do that as a full group, and then split into two groups, and just for 5 minutes, basically discuss this question and then come back. I also, sorry, in terms of timekeeping, before we discuss that, in terms of timekeeping, this was going to go on until 8 p.m. I saw someone ask that earlier on. That was that. So does that sound okay? Great. Okay. General agreement. Cool. Okay. So Keith, if we, and maybe Kathy as well, if we can just quickly go through these chat, well, not necessarily quickly, we could go into slight depth. I saw Michelle's, we covered the random one. Who would determine the experts? Again, this kind of is, it basically depends how you design it. What we're asking for is that you would set up, you would have various checks and balances within the structure of the Citizens' Assembly. So you would have an oversight panel, which would be reviewing all of the decisions that have been made. So maybe I should start with, you have a coordinating group, okay? The coordinating group is someone like these organizations such as Involve or My Society, or there's about half a dozen or 10 or so in the UK that regularly carry out citizens' assemblies or similar processes. That would be the coordinating group. They're sort of the specialists in actually running a deliberative process, okay? And that would be, the selection of that group would be by a public tender. And then that group would be responsible for selecting the experts, normally. But the decisions that they make have to be approved by an oversight panel. And on that oversight panel, what we are suggesting is that you would also have randomly selected citizens once again, okay? So that you have another check and balance, as it were, so that you're not getting people with too much power in terms of the decisions that are made. Submissions can only be made if public are aware and know how to. Exactly. It's really important that this is publicized. You have different examples across the world, some of which where it's really not very well publicized, and then it kind of is a bit of a damp squib, and it's easier for the government to ignore. And then you have ones like the Ireland example, which we keep mentioning, which was very well known. And there's things like V Taiwan, which is using basically sort of social media, and that is an extremely well publicized process, which actually came about through a protest movement in Taiwan as well. So yeah, it's just really important that the public are made aware. recommendations may not be implemented exactly. That's why it's really the government has to have buy-in from the get-go. And if the government does carry out a process such as this, which is kind of on the cards, that they don't, where it's not clear that the Assembly has decision-making power, then XR is not accepting that as our demand being met effectively. Keith, did you want to take over a bit on these questions, or do you think?
Just on that point,
yeah.
We may not actually, if the government actually agreed to a citizens' assembly, we don't necessarily need it to be legislated because they've already agreed to it and to agree to the outcome. And if they basically go back on that, then we would just go back on the streets again. The trouble is trying to get something into law to allow citizens' assembly to guide the country might take you a decade. So we just have to be careful there what we're trying to ask for.
Okay.
I think we've done most of the questions.
About self-selection. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Again, Kathy's kind of added to my point there. Irish Assembly, all the presentations, PowerPoint documents presented to the Assembly were available online. Presentations were live streamed. Okay.
There's a central site called participedia.net, which has all the deliberative assemblies from the world. I think they've just updated the interface. And they put everything in there, and a whole load of them have all the videos, everything. So if you really want to dive deep, go there or talk to Alex, who's also studying it really deeply, I think.
Yeah, when I get the time. So, I'll maybe do this bit and just wave at me, Kathy or Keith, if you want to jump in. Why do we need a National Citizens' Assembly on Climate and Ecological Justice? Okay, only the national government has the power to enact the necessary action. So there's obviously, many of you may have heard or even been involved in a real groundswell of interest in deliberative democracy at local level as well. And there's lots of councils who have run or will be running these kinds of deliberative mini publics. But building on that, you also need the national government to be taking action here for obvious reasons, because there are certain powers which are not decentralized. So that's the important point here. Representative democracy is not fit for solving long-term problems. So again, this is the idea that the problem with the current system is that we're trapped in these 5-year or not even 5-year electoral cycles at the moment, where you're basically all of the politicians are thinking too much about the next election, which is understandable in the system we're in. It's a human thing to be doing, to be wanting to get re-elected, but it's a systemic flaw because it means that you don't address these ongoing long-term problems because you can just keep putting it off, and you know that it hopefully won't affect your career. But unfortunately, because of this, I say unfortunately is an understatement. Because of this, we're facing a climate and ecological crisis because our system is not built to address these long-term problems, and that's where a citizens' assembly comes in. These are some of the issues with parliamentary democracy. One person represents many issues. They're led by opinion polls. So this was something actually that Catherine was mentioning in our small group, was that democracy should be, I'm basically stealing this from Catherine, democracy should be about informed choices. So the idea of deliberative democracy is you move from public opinion to judgment. And that's a real key word here. So you're actually learning about the issues, and these people at the assembly are given the resources and the time to really get to grips with an issue. So at the kind of assembly that we're calling for, there would be several weekends dedicated to learning about the science, and not just the science, also some of the policy areas, and the challenges that stakeholders are raising, facing. Sorry. Yeah, so that's the key difference there. Politicians align with a party, disagree with opposition. So there are party allegiances that they have to think about, not necessarily always thinking about exactly what the population need. They're not demographically representative, the House of Commons, and especially not the House of Lords. And for reasons explained earlier, the Citizens' Assembly is by definition demographically representative. And also there's the influence of lobby groups and vested interests in Parliament. And a well-run Citizens' Assembly would be protected from those groups. So this is basically the flip side. Citizens' Assemblies, you can think long-term, you make public judgments, what I just said, it's transparent. Those are the things that Kathy was saying earlier in relation to the Irish Citizens' Assembly. You know, they're live streamed, all the documentation is made available. They break the political deadlock. This, Keith's already talked a lot about this. So in relation to, say, abortion is the classic example, but also climate change would be a similar one, where they're not moving on a particular issue. And it's basically an upgrade to democracy. It's deepening democracy, we often say. So it's not, this is actually maybe a key point that might come up in criticism, because people think of elections, the electoral system, or our representative system as synonymous with democracy. If you suggest anything else, it sounds like you're challenging the idea of democracy. Well, it's quite the opposite. This is actually deepening democracy. This is a picture of the House of Commons from earlier this year during a climate change debate. So you had 40 members sit in the chamber from the total of 650 MPs. So you see that the level of engagement is not there. What could a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice look like? Keith, do you want to take over for this bit, or just because I realise I feel like I'm talking constantly, but I can also dive in on any slides.
What would it look like? Is there a slide to help me? No. We're looking at probably 600 to 1,000 people, and they would all go through. We've basically been talking to Citizens' Assembly experts about this. This has not been done before at this scale. So we're figuring out best practice to do it. And what we've thought about is having essentially a group of smaller citizens' assemblies. So initially, these 600 to 1,000 people would all have basic training in critical thinking, bias detection, issues around decolonisation, and also the basic facts of climate science. And then they would sit around and decide, and then a group of those, I think 100 or 200, would decide the agenda that was going to happen, that was then going to go on. And then from that agenda, we would then have thematic panels, which would just be another CA. So we'd have maybe a thematic panel, another CA about transport, one about farming, etc., depending on how they thought the best way to go forward was. And there would be some cross-pollination between these, because everything can't be done in isolation. But it would be a way of breaking the problem down from the huge problem of how do we get the entire country to zero carbon, down to how do you get just small units down to zero carbon. So that's how it would work. And as mentioned before, there'd be an oversight body running alongside to make sure everything's working okay. And there'd be other checks and balances. And once they'd delivered their recommendations to government, there would be an ongoing body that would then continuously check to see how the government is doing these, whether it's implementing these, to make sure they stay on track. So that's what we've kind of decided.
And the proposition that would be put to the Citizens' Assembly, so every assembly has a particular wording that's presented to them at the beginning, the kind of question, and this is basically the second demand. Our second demand would be the proposition put to the Assembly before it's broken down into these separate ones. So how can the government reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero and halt biodiversity loss by 2025?
We have to put the slight caveat on it that we don't really want it to be a kind of fascist solution. So it can't really basically, well, we're just going to shoot everyone. So it has to be there has to be an element of social and ecological justice in there as well, which is tricky things. You come from the initial point of going, we just need to get to zero carbon, then you start to look at all the aspects around it. So
yeah, exactly. And these are here. There's just two criticisms that you might hear, that it would be too expensive. A citizens' assembly of the kind we're calling for might cost about £1 million, and the House of Lords costs £19 million annually. And in terms of, a lot of people say but in fact, I think it's almost intuitive, maybe because we're just so used to the current system we're in, to be like, that sounds crazy. You're just going to ask a load of random, literally you're using the word random citizens to make these kinds of decisions. But there are lots of examples of showing that the wisdom of the masses, a diverse group, the more diverse a group is, the more different forms of intelligence you're bringing into the room. And also the kinds of decisions that are coming out of these citizens' assemblies are often slightly more progressive than, or even a lot more progressive than, governments are coming up with. For instance, these examples of the Irish climate change one. And B, they're reasonable. They're in line, as we saw, the 64-66% comparison earlier on in the Irish abortion example. They're in line basically with the views of the population, as you would expect. Yeah, and it's just really, and the other thing is also that obviously if you've got a group of people who are, where you really can identify with people on that panel or on that assembly, sorry, then you're much more likely to trust in that process and to trust the outcomes. Okay. It's an evidence-based democratic solution. So it's while XR is obviously a radical organization, and while this may, like I say, almost intuitively seem like quite a radical suggestion, it's actually a proven process around the world, and it's based on scientific evidence that this that this can work. So it's not kind of someone's pulled it out of their sleeves. Okay, and then the end of this presentation, we've got another example of how can we achieve a national citizen assembly. So this is another point where you could break off into groups and have a talk about that. Let's maybe not do that today, so that we've got a chance to talk all as a main group. I'm also conscious that Kathy's going to talk a little bit as well. Maybe I'll just say, so the UK National Citizens Assembly Working Group, of which we are 3 representatives, Kathy, Keith and myself. We, apart from doing this kind of thing, we're also helping to put forward proposals. What Keith was basically going into some detail there about in terms of the design of the Citizens Assembly. We're lobbying government, so we have put together a parliamentary bill with other XR groups as well, which contains the 3 demands. And I think he said earlier on, sorry, I was taking notes when he said that, but I think that we met MPs the other day and we gave them our guides, and we have a number of MPs who are willing to sponsor that bill now. And we're informing the public. So we're holding these kinds of talks with the more general people. I mean, not necessarily XR members as well. I think we do quite a lot of other things as well, but maybe that's enough. If you've got specific questions, we can go into more detail.
And just a lot of talking to people and leafleting as well. So just spreading the word about this. So yeah,
we're also obviously really involved in the planning the October Rebellion as well, and we've got some actions planned for that. So anyone, I can't remember who it was, but someone was based in London as well, or anyone coming down to London for that and want to help us out with any of our actions, then definitely let us know, because we have an abundance of ideas and not quite enough hands to to get a vote?
Yeah, I'm definitely keen.
Okay. Oh, cool. Thanks. Thanks, Natasha. So actually, I forgot to say at the start, we've actually got all your emails. If you all had to register basically to enter here, so we automatically have your emails, which is great. So that's good to know, Natasha. Anyone else who wants to get more involved in some of the other things we do in addition to the talk, then let us know that specifically as well. Maybe I'll hand over to Kathy to talk a bit more about what the next step is basically.
And what would happen is I would send you out a pack with links to the different elements, to the guide, so that you could read that. You could look through the PowerPoint. You can see the webinar. And then there's a link to the basic standards that Keith talked about. So there are basic standards that we're expecting citizens' assemblies to use. So then the idea is that it's quite daunting, the thought of doing a talk, but you could start off doing it to your affinity group, or to your local group, or even start with your family. I did it at the weekend. I mean, I haven't done that many. I did in Parliament Square during the rebellion. We gave some talks on the citizens' assemblies and helped facilitate people's assemblies. But what I did with the North London Rising the other day with another member of our group, which was pretty effective, we just sort of did a chat talk, because you can't have a screen when you're outside. So during the rebellion, you're not going to have a screen. So we did a sort of chat where one asks the question, the other answers. And it's like, it sort of helps prompt your memory and remind you what you need to cover. So you don't have to be an expert. That you have to remember, you don't have to be an expert, but you have to say, I don't know, rather than try and give incorrect information. So you could do it in your local group, council meetings, community centres. I mean, I'm thinking about trying to approach sort of sixth form politics at schools, so they learn about it. And what we did, oh right, yes, I wanted to explain. So we did this chat style explanation of what a citizens' assembly is. And then we had a people's assembly afterwards, in which we asked the question, I'm going to write it, so we deliberated on, why do you think a citizens' assembly is a good idea? Oh no, that wasn't it. Oh, it was, what would your top answer be for why a citizens' assembly is a better way to address the climate and ecological emergency? So we had about 100 people. They went off into groups of about 8. They sat down and they deliberated. And it was a really good way of doing it, because they'd already had the information, the teaching, and then they were thinking about it. So I think they went away having really absorbed it in a more meaningful way than if one person just stood up and given a lecture. It's trying to make... So I've been thinking about ways of how we can do it during the rebellion, which might be sort of having somebody holding a washing line, and you can just pick somebody out of the crowd, to hold a washing line, and then have some keywords like submissions, collective intelligence, fairness, and bring them up, have a quick chat, peg them up, so that deliberation, I can't think of them off my head, but trying to think of ways of delivering it outside of with the screen, because you often don't actually have access to a screen. When you send in emails to Proton Mail, currently I'm the one sort of receiving them, so I would do my best to ring anybody, send anything supporting resources that we have. And I just sort of encourage you all to have a go. It's a bit daunting to begin with, but we just need, it's out there a lot, it's been in a few newspapers, people are hearing about citizens' assemblies, and quite often that it's inaccurate. They're not proper standards. It's just a sort of another form of consultation, which we don't want to perpetuate that idea. So it needs to be clear what the expectations are of a citizens' assembly, and that it's not just another meaningless royal commission that costs a fortune and isn't even followed up with. It's radical change that we're hoping for. Anyway, anybody got anything they would like to ask that I could maybe?
I was just maybe going to add quickly about the People's Assembly bit, which is, I think, is really great to integrate a People's Assembly into the talk. So, and I just wanted to remind everyone that there was the slide where there's a guide to People's Assemblies. That's a great thing to browse through, especially the hand signals. So it's good if you're going to do a People's Assembly and it's occurred to me while we've been doing this today, we've all been going like that, and maybe Catherine, who's new to XR from yesterday, is wondering why we're going like this. So that means agreement. And yeah, it's good if you're going to do a People's Assembly to take people through the hand signals and maybe just have a quick read of that guide as well. Yeah, Kathy, sorry.
This means I want to say something. I'm not mute, am I? Am I? No, right.
No, you're not mute.
Right.
Are you demonstrating or do you have something to say?
And I've now forgotten what I wanted to say. Sorry, I've forgotten.
So, Catherine?
Right, I'm kind of a little bit flummoxed about the difference between a People's Assembly as a concept and the Citizens' Assembly, and why it was decided specifically to call it a Citizens' Assembly.
Keith, go for it.
Thanks. Yeah.
So the term Citizens' Assembly has been around a long time, but then somebody in XR decided to call the other one a People's Assembly. So the fact that the two are very similar is very annoying, and we've suggested earlier on that they change it, but it was just too late. The guides have been printed. So a People's Assembly is just the group of people who are there, just whoever's happened to be around, get them to sit around in circles and deliberate. You get a note taker, facilitator, and you sit around in a group of about 8 to 10 people. It's a really quite a powerful thing. And then all those ideas are note taken and then taken forward. Whereas
so that could be something completely ad hoc.
Absolutely, yeah.
Anybody could do. Okay.
I mean, if the group of us were standing around the street now, we could sit down and have a very quick People's Assemblies, possibly with 2 groups. We did it at the big tent. We did a talk about citizens' assemblies and the whole XR thing. And then afterwards, we had 2 groups, two People's Assemblies, like 10 in each group. But a citizens' assembly is something where, I mean, the one for Cambridge, we wrote the proposal, and then about 6 months later, we managed to get funding for it. And then another 3-4 months of getting experts, sending out invites, getting them together, finding venues, organising food, hotels, transport, massive undertaking. So the one in Cambridge cost about 60 grand, whereas People's Assembly cost some pens and paper. So that's the key difference. I mean, one is a big undertaking. One is an effectively fairly non-legitimate deliberation group.
Thanks. Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Go on.
Well, teenagers, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, would they be excluded from the Citizens' Assembly?
So it depends on what you're trying to decide on. So we're just doing it. I think the ones we've looked at so far, I think it's 18 over, but I don't know if it's actually specified in the instructions. For a national one, we would probably go down to 15, I would have thought, possibly younger, or possibly you have side citizens' assemblies or other deliberative methods to maybe go out to primary schools, figure out how they feel about their future. and what they think they should be doing to be fed back in. Because that's the most powerful thing, is basically children going, seriously. But no, they shouldn't. There doesn't have to be an age limit. There's no, and also the term citizen. We're stuck with the term, but the US are going, but citizens, that's funny here. Here we do it on the ones we've sent out so far. We've done the postcode database. A national one would probably use more than just a postcode database, and also have to do outreach to maybe homeless people, possibly people in prisons, to make sure that it is truly a mini public, truly representative of everyone in the country. So keep the term citizen assembly, because we've now got a brand for that. Don't try and change that, but just bear in mind it's not people who are effectively citizens.
I saw that Liz had a question.
Yep.
Liz, can you hear? Yeah, you need to unmute.
Oh,
yeah.
Hey, I couldn't find the mute. Yeah, it's a good question. The difference between citizens' assemblies and people's assemblies is tricky, but I think emphasizing binding power of what comes out of them is important. And then in the United States, people's assemblies, I'm calling in from New York, has a long tradition dating back to the Black South in the 1830s, the Negro Convention movement. And it's a really important part of dual power. And anyways, yeah, you can just get it started. And it doesn't always have to be about decision making. It could be about tasking. So it's pretty different than citizens' assemblies from my understanding. Thanks.
Thanks. I also, I think it was also used in the Arab Spring, Occupy, people's assemblies. Been used in lots of different mass movements. I was wondering, I just thought maybe a good way also to think of the difference is that is this right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but a people's assembly kind of affects the group that's making it. There is no mini public. It's everybody who is there making a decision about their own. For instance, in the April Rebellion, there were several people's assemblies. One of them was, when do we end the rebellion? It was on the halfway through the second week. And it was just, it wasn't everyone involved in the rebellion, but it was everyone at Marble Arch at that moment, which was a few thousand people. And we had this mass people's assembly. Whereas a citizens' assembly, you'll be a mini public, basically representing everyone else.
Kathy?
Also, it goes on over a long period of time. It is really a long period of learning and deliberating. I just wanted to say a couple of things that I thought was important that perhaps wasn't mentioned, that the invitations are sent out to people, and I think that's quite important how they're worded to be appealing and inclusive. And there's also great attention paid to the venue and the food, and for people to know that if they have care costs that they're covered, that the venues are accessible, and that it is really important. It's understood to be really important to be concerned with the well-being of the assembly members, so that everybody's in a good place and everybody is therefore in a position to receive things openly, with an open mind, I think. And also, when you do the talk, I would say I think it's really good if you do it with someone rather than doing it on your own, because it just makes it a bit more user-friendly. Two voices are always more interesting than one, and it makes it less sort of like a lecture.
Also, Michelle asked in the chat, Kathy, could we repeat the examples of who we give the talk to?
Who you could. Michelle, it's probably quite good to start off maybe with your family or your affinity group if you're part of one, or your local XR group. I was thinking today, I was talking to somebody, they said to me it's not quite the moment, but I was thinking that we ought to go and talk to the local Labour Party, also the local Hold My Breath Conservative Party. And the idea is to try and get invited to explain to people what it is. I'm also thinking particularly important is young people, that they understand it. I mean, ideally, I'd like to go into a secondary school and do a talk on citizens' assemblies, and then have a people's assembly where they talk about it and think about it, what they might think is a good idea, or what they might think isn't a good idea about it. What else?
So, do other people have questions? We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Any burning final questions? Yeah, but the other thing I wanted to say as well, in terms of places where you can give a talk, you can also, do it at the October Rebellion with us. That would be great. You can give the talk. Sorry, you might have said this, Kathy, but I'm struggling to keep all of the balls in the air. At roadblocks, at direct actions, you can also give this talk. There are a few things I don't think. Oh no, I did. That's how I got involved. I'm just remembering. I was going to say at the April Rebellion, I was like, did I see one? Yeah, I did. That's how I actually found out about the whole thing. And it's really dramatic, right? You find out about deliberative democracy while being surrounded by police, or these kinds of things. It's a really high intensity and powerful moment to transmit these kinds of ideas. But anyway, you don't have to do that.